You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another conversation with MEMO, hosted by Naseem Ahmed. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Victor Kattan. Hello, Victor. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Naseem. It's a pleasure to be here and good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Victor is an assistant professor in public international law at the University of Nottingham School of Law. He is a member of the, his bio is quite long. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. The key paragraphs. He is a member of the editorial board of the Asian Journal of International Law and is area editor for the Middle East and Islam for Oxford Biographies of International Law. Victor is also an author of a number of books, of one monogram, 4 edited books, and more than 30 single-authored articles that have been published and peer-reviewed by peer-reviewed journals. And today I asked Victor to join us to discuss an article he published recently, last week, I think, on a forum called Just Security. The title of Victor's article is The Implications of an ICJ Finding that Israel is Committing the Crime Against Humanity of Apartheid. And by way of background, this hearing took place in The Hague last month, from 19th to the 26th of February, after the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution in December 2022 requesting an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the legality of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territories. So many of you would have heard and listened to some of the testimonies and statements that was issued on the at the ICJ. So this is separate to the genocide hearing. This was related to whether the occupation of Israel is actually illegal or not illegal. And more than 50 states, the African Union, the Arab League, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation all delivered statements during the hearing. So, Victor, if I may, you wrote about that extensively. Your article is quite long, and you point out that several states, 24 in total, claimed before the ICJ that Israel is imposing an apartheid regime on the Palestinians. And you go on to say this is groundbreaking and it's a really important development. So just quickly summarize for us why this is such an important milestone when it comes to holding Israel to account.
Thanks, Naseem. I think it's important because the claim, as you know, that Israel's practicing apartheid is not a new one. It's been out there for a long time, but mainly it was confined to discussions amongst academics, left-wing intellectuals, and then more recently NGOs. You'll recall about 2 or 3 years ago, some blue-chip NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International published some reports supporting the claim that Israel's policies and practices were tantamount to apartheid. What's significant is that governments are now appear to be endorsed, or some governments, at least 24 states, have come out and accepted or acknowledged that claim. And not only that, they've gone so far as to articulate that claim before the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, namely the International Court of Justice. And I think that that's significant because states hadn't really said much or hadn't looked at in detail at the issue as much as before. So if I give you one example, Namibia, which was a state that suffered under apartheid when it was known as Southwest Africa, as well as South Africa for that matter, submitted statements to the courts that went into a lot of detail. Namibia's written statement was completely devoted, I think except for a page on illegal occupation, devoted to making the claim that Israel's committing the crime against humanity of apartheid against the Palestinian people. So that's for me, it's significant for two things. One, that they made the argument before the court, but also it's significant because at least, you mentioned 24 states, at least 16 of those states are parties to the International Convention on Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid from 1973. So in theory, in principle, these states could re-establish the treaty monitoring body established by that convention, which was suspended in 1995 following the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa and the end of apartheid. They could re-establish that committee to look at the allegations that Israel's committing apartheid today.
Yeah, so what you mentioned, the mechanism. So those mechanisms had existed before for many years in monitoring apartheid in South Africa, apartheid in, as you mentioned, in Namibia. So what are these mechanisms that could be reconstituted or triggered again? Does the ICJ need to issue a statement declaring Israel to be an apartheid state, or can these states which are party to the convention simply reactivate those mechanisms to monitor apartheid in Israel?
The states don't need to wait for the ICJ, and we don't know what the court will say. I mean, obviously, if the court comes out with an opinion and it goes into some detail and endorses a claim, that's going to be very helpful politically. But they don't need it because it just needs one state, for that matter, to raise the issue with the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. Of course, if you have more support, that's helpful. And then initiate these discussions. And Namibia, in fact, already raised this issue 2 years ago in a debate in the UN Human Rights Council. So there are discussions and there is support there, but you'd need the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian leadership, to take that step, obviously. But you don't need to wait for the court. Now, of course, as I said, if the court does say something interesting, then it makes, it's probably easier to lobby other states to come in beyond the 24 states that already hold this view. But in principle, you don't need to wait for the court to say anything about this.
Yeah, so two of the key institutions of that mechanism is the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid and the Group of Three. So just give us a brief explanation of what those two offices are: the UN Special Committee and the Group of Three.
UN Special Committee was established by the UN General Assembly, I think, in 1961. So it was like a special ad hoc body that focused exclusively on practices of apartheid. It raised awareness of what was going inside the country, funded studies, coordinated activities to put pressure on South Africa to end its apartheid policy. The Group of Three was a treaty monitor. So that was a standing. So the UN Special Committee was like a permanent, or it's not permanent, but it was a permanent in the sense that it existed until it was dissolved after the end of apartheid. But it was always there all the time. So it was expensive, I guess, to fund and operate, more so than the Group of Three, which is a treaty monitoring body established by the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which only met, I think it was, for 5 days a year. And that body was mainly diplomats. So I think we'd have to reform that body to make sure it's comprised of independent experts as opposed to UN officials. And they did studies on apartheid in South Africa. At that time, there was no international criminal court. So they proposed establishing a court to try the crime of apartheid. They drew attention to the role of transnational companies in sustaining apartheid and naming and shaming. They named individuals responsible for the crime of apartheid and circulated these like a blacklist, circulated these amongst the UN and generally raised awareness. And in addition, every state party to that treaty every year, they were expected to appear before it and explain what they were doing in terms of their legislation and their policies to put pressure on South Africa to end apartheid. So in addition to the fact that they had to draft legislation punishing individuals for committing the crime and domestically, they were also looking at what they were doing, whether it was media, economic, their foreign policies to isolate South Africa. So that's what it was doing. That's what all these different bodies were doing. And I think they were useful because, of course, during the Cold War, I might be anticipating one of your what you're going to come and say later, is that
Yeah.
the Security Council was dysfunctional as it is now, and so it was important to have these ad hoc institutions that were in principle open to all member states to undertake measures without waiting or without seeking approval from the Security Council.
I mean, you mentioned earlier the number of major human rights groups that have determined that Israel is committed the crime of apartheid. So in 1 year, Amnesty, Human Rights, B'Tselem joined the ranks of many other Palestinian groups. And now I think it's fair to say that there is a wall-to-wall consensus within the international human rights group, at least, that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. But of course, there's been no response to that by the states. And the US has dismissed it. Many of Israel's major allies have dismissed those reports, even though they rely on those very same institutions and organizations when they make determinations on various other countries. But what would be different now in this case? Say a country like Namibia comes up and says Israel is practicing apartheid. South Africa makes the same conclusion. A number of other African countries make the same conclusion. I mean, can that really have a major impact, given that the Western allies of Israel have kind of dismissed the human rights groups already? Can they also just simply dismiss the states, or can the states effectively start a boycott campaign on a state level rather than on a civic society level? Is there something that could happen as a result of this?
I mean, you're right. I mean, it's the global South that, I mean, apartheid is a global South crime. It's a crime that was drafted and supported and articulated by states of the global South, so Namibia, South Africa, basically African and Asian countries. And the Western countries never supported the Special Committee or the Group of Three, never even signed the Apartheid Convention. So it would be limited, but there's enough. Those states are growing in clout and importance and influence, and I think that they could be impactful. They could also raise these issues with Western countries. There are, of course, I mean, those human rights groups are mainly Western as well that you mentioned.
Yes,
based in Western countries.
That's
so
right.
the civil society groups to put pressure on their democratic governments to change their policies. But again, it comes down to political will to make these changes, and that's where this issue is in constant tension with human rights is in tension with realpolitik, if you like, and that I don't think that is changing, unfortunately. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
I mean, I think we shouldn't be too dejected. I mean, as you mentioned in your own article, we are living in very similar times. During South Africa was supported by the US, the UK, and major Israeli allies, France, and they're the same countries who are now supporting Israel. So despite the support that was given by Western allies to apartheid South Africa, the apartheid movement, just snowballed and was marked the beginning of end of apartheid South Africa. So we shouldn't lose hope, even though at the moment many of these countries are completely opposed to any kind of sanctions or BDS against Israel. But one thing that is growing is discussions around stopping the arms sale to Israel. A number of Western countries, Canada, Japan, Belgium, Holland, they've all in some shape or form cut arms sales to Israel. And UK just this recently over the weekend, there was reports that the government has been given advice by government lawyers that Israel is potentially committing war crimes against humanity, and therefore it should reconsider selling arms to Israel. So that's something that's already brewing. And you're saying in your article that if there is a determination by the ICJ that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid, then automatically it triggers, imposes on governments to stop arms sales, and is something which we could also see as a consequence of the ICJ determination.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's automatically that if the ICJ were to endorse this claim, they may not. There may be division in the bench. The UN Arms Trade Treaty. Let me see what it says. It says the relevant bit. I'll bring it up. It says that the treaty prohibits any transfer of conventional arms, ammunition, and spare parts if a state party has knowledge at the time of authorization, so that's the time they decide to transfer the weapons, that these weapons would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. So it's about showing that they had knowledge of the authorization. Now, the fact that the legal advisors, you mentioned this report in The Guardian, the fact that the UK's legal advisors, if the report's true, and we don't know, of course, we don't know exactly what they said because it hasn't been published, but if the report's true that the UK's own legal advisors made that determination that they have enough evidence, because they get information from a whole bunch of sources, right? They're supposed to do, I think I don't know how often the review is taken, but there's an ongoing. These reviews are ongoing.
Even Labour doesn't know what the details are. I mean, this morning, a Labour representative came on air and said that, oh, we don't know the details of maybe he's just obfuscating, we don't know, but the details have not been shared. So it's very difficult to make any definitive conclusions on that. Sorry.
But my point, though, is if the report is true that the legal advisors who presumably have this information said that Israel's committing crimes against humanity of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, well, then you've had the determination made by your lawyers, and it would be, and of course, at the end of the day, the government, I suppose, doesn't have to accept what the lawyers say. You'd like to think, though, in a society or a state that claims they abide by the rule of law, they take legal advice seriously. But if that determination has been made, then there's a much stronger argument to say, well, the UK should also follow through by not transferring arms. And if I recall, the options that were presented to David Cameron, no, it wasn't David Cameron, it was the Secretary of State for Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah,
were to continue transfer, to limit the transfer of weapons that are being specifically used in Gaza, or to have a complete ban on weapons. She chose to continue sending them. So she didn't even choose option 2, which would have been the sensible one to say, well, one option, if you didn't want to go for the full hog, is to say, we know these weapons are being used in Gaza, we know there are crimes there, therefore we're not going to continue to sell them. But they didn't even go for that. That determination was made last year, so maybe there's a new determination that's going to be made imminently. I mean, especially since we have UK citizens now being apparently directly targeted, as we learned this morning, a missile going through the roof of a car, killing a British citizen and Australians and others, and the conflict, as everyone can see on the screens, is getting more and more horrific, with attacks on hospitals and mass displacement and the like. One would hope that the UK joins other countries like Canada and others you mentioned in limiting the provision of weapons, and yet at the same time we see the Americans, if the stories are to be believed, are transferring a huge amount of weapons or imminently to Israel. So again, I think it's important that the UK, other countries like Germany and France, who also supply weapons to Israel, desist from doing so. But at the end of the day, it's the Americans who are the big arms supplier to the Israelis. The Israeli systems are all based on the American system, and until we see a change there, a real significant change in American policy, it seems that they're content to continue sending these weapons.
Yes, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. The Biden administration last week concluded that US arms is not being used to commit war crimes and violate US laws, which completely goes against what we know. But again, that's a different discussion. But I wanted to ask you on the threshold for genocide and the threshold for determining apartheid. So there's 2 cases at the moment which the ICJ is looking into, the genocide case and the apartheid case. And you explain that, the threshold for apartheid is way lower and therefore more likely to see a positive decision, whereas genocide is more harder to prove. So can you just outline the distinction and why it's relevant?
So genocide is a crime of specific intent. You have to show that policymakers intended to destroy a protected group in whole or in parts, like a double intent. Whereas the crime of apartheid is a crime that's the way in which the crime is defined is based on the system or the bigger kind of structural, legal and political and administrative system under which multiple crimes against humanity occur. So these are usually published. So no one's going to admit to doing, committing genocide. Having said that, with the amount of statements the Israelis have made, generally speaking, people don't want. You've got to find the smoking gun, some kind of document which outlines that this was their intention to destroy, for example, a protected group rather than displace them. Yeah. With apartheid, you simply have to demonstrate the existence of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and discrimination and domination, which you can do by looking at a state's constitutions, its administrative laws, its policies, and these are usually published in some form. And under the Rome Statute, you have to show that this group that is systematically discriminating another group intends to maintain the regime. And you can also demonstrate that, for instance, they're not allowing political parties or placing limitations on the right to vote, the right to participate, to form your own political party, restrictions on movement, etc., forced displacement, a whole host of the crime lists a whole host of what they call inhumane acts, and any one of those could constitute the crime if the overall context is present.
What was interesting about what you said was throughout the genocide case, the defense of the Israelis, when individual statement of intent to commit genocide was mentioned, from Netanyahu to the president and many other officials, was that they're not state policy, even though they're made by they're not state policy. What you're saying is that it's much easier to prove state policy when it comes to apartheid. All you have to do is look at the West Bank and see that there is state policy to separate Palestinians from Jews from Palestinians. Jewish only settlements is just one example of many where there is state policy to have a racist regime in place. So,
or the nation state law, which is the most obvious one from 2018, which says, for example, the right to self-determination in the land of Israel, which they don't define, is exclusive to the Jewish people. I mean, exclusivity. Only one group has that right. The other group doesn't. You can't get it more clearer than that.
That's right. Yeah. And one thing that's, we touched on this already. The fact that there is a divide between the North and the South, and you mentioned that civic organization, ad hoc, institutions need to play a much greater role in enforcing international law. That's something I think the ICJ also mentioned in its 2004 ruling on the wall, to demanding the dismantling of the wall and encouraging civil societies and the rest to take on the mantle and the responsibility and the duty of doing that. I mean, what more can they do? I think you touched on that in your article. What more can these organizations do in dismantling the apartheid system that's currently in place?
You mean NGOs?
NGOs, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the ICJ. I mean, okay, maybe I'll start with the ICJ. The ICJ will deliver an opinion. We don't know what the opinion will look like. We don't know what it will say. We don't know what the majority will be. Sometimes judges will narrow their differences and to get a consensus, so it looks more authoritative. But in the process of doing that, they may say less interesting things. For example, on apartheid, we don't know. But the problem is that the opinion is in and of itself, it's not binding. Although it's an authoritative opinion, and states can choose to ignore it or abide by it. We still have a very 19th century consent-based system of international relations. It's not very sophisticated. It's a horizontal system, so the enforcement machinery always goes back to the UN Security Council. And because we know it's deadlocked, it's important for civil society and NGOs to raise these issues, which they are doing. But ultimately, it's for governments, but also maybe multinational companies as well. They're so powerful. Some of these are richer than states are. To do more. I mean, maybe that's an angle one could explore more. Why are these multinational companies not pulling out of Israel as they did, for example, when Russia? Oh, Ben and Jerry's. Okay, I mean, most of them have. Some of them have. But why they haven't on the scale, for example, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we haven't seen as much movement. So yeah.
So as a final question before we finish, what key milestones should we be looking at going forward? So when is the decision likely? And so what are the next steps on this ruling over the occupied Palestinian territories?
So I expect if we go by what happened last time in 2004, the court delivered. It was around the same period. In 2004, the oral hearings were in February, and the court delivered its opinion in July of that year. I think it was the 6th of July or something. And I suspect by July or August, maybe, or most likely July, we will get an opinion from the court. And the question then, the opinion is then formally sent to the United Nations General Assembly, which is the body that requested the opinion, and they'll have a debate, and then it's up to states again to either adhere to it or ignore. And we know what the positions are, so the majority of states will accept it. But the usual suspects, that is the United States, the UK, and all those countries that were opposed to the advisory opinion will take note of it, reject it, or politely, pretend it didn't happen. And then that's why I in my piece I was trying to get the Palestinians, because it has to be the Palestinian leadership, to take the initiative. I know they're overwhelmed right now with what's going on in the Gaza Strip, but one has to try to think ahead of the day after this opinion is delivered and think about longer term strategy, and that's why I think the role of bringing back to life, or resuscitating, if you like, these institutions that appeared to do good work in combating apartheid in South Africa could be repurposed for the struggle against apartheid in Israel. And again, it's a question of state will. We already know we have 24 states who went so far as to participate in the advisory opinion, went to the expense of getting their lawyers to produce these reports and these submissions and travel to The Hague to make the argument. So at least they've got a solid number of states that are hold a strong view, and could be used to build up a campaign to take this further. But at the end of the day, it does need a leadership from the Palestinian side to do that, because it's a state organization, and because the Palestinians have a observer status in the UN. They are best positioned to do that. But my understanding is that they're mainly focused at the time for the time being on the statehood issue. They really want states to recognize the few states that haven't recognized them. They want them to recognize them. But I think that's important. But I think they shouldn't lose their sight of the bigger, longer term goal, because I don't think it's going to get any better what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem, and they need to be thinking ahead.
Yeah, what you're referring to is the 2004 decision by the ICJ. Many have said that the Palestinians failed to make more out of it, and this was a tool that was handed, a moral victory that was handed to the Palestinians, and more should have done with it. I think we are in a different place now. If the ICJ was to conclude that Israel is committing a crime of apartheid, I think this would be huge, given the current situation we're in. This moral victory would probably be one of the biggest moral victory for the Palestinian cause. And given the context we're at the moment, the ongoing pressure to stop arms sales to Israel, not only will Israel become a pariah, more and more states will be forced to cut arms sales. Businesses and companies will be constantly pressurized to boycott Israel. We saw the impact of direct action against US weapons manufacturers in the UK. One had to close down as a result of that. So I think what you'll see is, of course, the US and the UK are always late to the game, but you'll see a groundswell of activism, not dissimilar to what happened in bringing down the South African apartheid regime around the world. And this would be a massive weapon and a victory to the pro-Palestinians. That's just my thoughts on if the ICJ makes the positive judgment we are hoping for. That's just my assessment of where that will go. I think we're in a different place at the moment, and as a result, the consequences will be far-reaching.
Yeah.
So any final thoughts on that?
Well, and I agree with you. And the question that's delivered, that's requested from the court, is much wider than it was back in 2003, 2004, when it was really focused on the wall that Israel, the so-called security barrier. This one is basically the entire occupation. I mean, I suspect the court will call on Israel to end its occupation, and will go so far as to say it's illegal. The bigger question is whether they'll go even further than that, and you know, say something useful about the crime of apartheid, and whether it's applicable to what is happening in the West Bank and Gaza and beyond even. We'll have to wait and see. But I do agree with you that we are in a different situation, although I find it very depressing that it is taken, you know, a purported genocide in Gaza to get here. I mean, what are we saving at the end of the day? We're saving people, but I mean, yeah, there's been so much suffering and destruction. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. It was really a pleasure to have you on our show. Really enjoyed that. I hope your viewers at home have learned something and taken something away from our conversation. Thank you, and I hope to see you in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Naseem. It's been great. Great pleasure.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.